Hi friends. Long before the medieval world, ancient civilizations created execution methods so brutal, so unthinkable, that historians tried to bury the records. Tonight, we're uncovering the darkest punishments ever hidden from history, and some of these will haunt you. Let's begin. Whispers beneath the hanging tree. The night settles slowly over the old clearing, as if laying a gentle hand across the earth to quiet the last murmurs of the day. Here, beneath a canopy of swaying branches, the air carries the faint scent of moss and distant rain. Nothing moves at first, just the quiet shifting of the leaves. But if one listens long enough, the space feels inhabited by memories too subtle to disturb the living. The hanging tree stands at the center of it, its silhouette leaning slightly, as though the centuries have bent it with the weight of stories no one meant to remember. A soft lantern glow seems to rise in the imagination alone, flickering across rough bark that once held a rope, the kind twisted from coarse fibers that time itself has long since swallowed. And yet, in the stillness of this place, it is easy to believe that the rope still sways not with wind, but with the echo of a presence no longer visible. Some say that dawnlight behaves strangely here, catching on empty branches with a hush that feels more like respect than illumination. Long before empires fully shaped their borders, before kings carved their names into stone, the act of hanging became one of humanity's most deceptively simple methods of ending life. There are references as early as the Code of Hammurabi, around 1750 BCE, where the penalty for certain crimes was described with blunt clarity, as though the ancient world saw no need to embellish the act itself. Yet, even this severe code left much to the imagination, for the method required nothing more than rope and tree tools so ordinary they blended seamlessly into the rhythm of daily survival. This ordinariness is precisely what made the practice unsettling. In some of the earliest records, a fringe detail emerges. Small charms or tokens were sometimes tied to the branches after an execution, not as memorials, but as silencing talismans, meant to appease what the community feared might linger. Scholars still debate whether these charms were truly widespread, or merely the invention of particular regions gripped by local superstition. But even now, the notion of them adds a faint tremor to the quiet. As the centuries unfolded, the act of hanging grew into a grimly efficient ritual. The Romans, meticulous in nearly everything, used it sparingly, preferring crucifixion for public statements. But in the shadows of the empire, it whispered its way into smaller disputes, carried out by local councils who sought not spectacle, but finality. Some ancient texts suggest that these smaller gatherings took place at twilight, with witnesses chosen not for their rank, but for their ability to keep secrets. Whether this was common practice or isolated tradition, the detail survives like a loose thread in a tapestry, hinting at emotions that official documents rarely acknowledge. Here, in our imagined clearing, the atmosphere reflects that forgotten side of history. One can envision a group of figures standing in a loose semicircle, cloaks wrapped tightly around their shoulders, breath visible in the cold. They would not speak much. Even those certain of the condemned's guilt might feel the heavy quiet settle into their bones. Hanging was never meant to be theatrical. It was final, abrupt, and profoundly human in its plainness. The condemned himself, perhaps a thief, perhaps someone accused by rumor, would have been brought forward with a slow inevitability. A simple wooden stool, or even a knot in the earth, would serve as the only elevation needed. And then, with a motion almost too gentle to describe, the rope would be placed around the neck. The branch above, chosen for its strength, would creak softly. In many cases, the moment passed in a breath. In others, the struggle lasted long enough that witnesses later spoke of the silence being broken by a single, sharp exhale. The tree, unmoving, listened to all of it. Over time, this tree, whether a real one in a real village or an amalgam of countless memories, became more symbol than object. Travelers passing through would avoid resting beneath its branches, claiming that animals refused to nest there. There is a curious reference in a set of medieval herbal manuscripts that describes certain trees near execution sites being unfit for remedies, as though the bark itself held a trace of sorrow. Scholars still debate whether this was a practical superstition or a poetic warning disguised as medical advice. Yet what lingers most in this clearing is not fear, but a stillness shaped by time's gentle erosion of violence. Where a rope once hung, now only a faint groove remains, barely visible under years of new growth. Moss blankets the roots. The earth has softened, reclaiming what human hands once disturbed. And in this softened quiet, the stories lose their sharp edges. The memory becomes less about the final moment, and more about the lives woven around it. The people who gathered, the judgments made, the truths known only to a few. As the lantern light dims in our mind's eye, the tree stands unchanged, patient as always. A breeze murmurs through its leaves, carrying with it a suggestion that even the harshest history can become a whisper with enough time. Yet the whisper beckons us onward, toward the next forgotten method waiting just beyond the tree line, where stones lie half buried in twilight, and the past prepares to reveal another of its quiet shadows. For now, though, the branches barely stir, as if sensing that something else is beginning to wake in the dusk beyond. Stones in the twilight ring. Twilight descends softly across the ancient clearing, as if the sky itself lowers its voice to match the hush of the earth. Only a few steps from where the hanging tree once held its silent vigil, another space emerges wider, flatter, encircled by stones that seem arranged not by human intention, but by the slow, deliberate hand of time. And yet, even at first glance, one feels the faint suggestion of design. The rocks form a loose ring, their edges rounded by centuries of wind and weather, their surfaces holding the cool glow of the dying day. Here, in the fragile light between sunset and darkness, shadows stretch thin and long across the ground. They slide over the stones as though tracing memories that have been waiting patiently to be acknowledged. One can imagine a gathering long ago, no roaring crowd, no elevated platform, just villagers or tribespeople standing at the periphery, watching someone step into the center of the ring. The atmosphere would have been different from that beneath the hanging tree. This method required not a single tool, but a collective action, however reluctant. Stoning is older than most written languages, and yet its origins remain curiously blurred. Scholars still debate whether it emerged from early communal concepts of justice or from ritualistic expulsions that later hardened into punishments. In the Hebrew Bible, references appear as early as the laws attributed to Moses, suggesting that by the first millennium BCE, the practice had already become codified within certain cultures. But the broader truth is that stoning existed in many places long before such texts were written, travelling quietly through oral histories, shaping itself to the customs of each region. One of the more fringe accounts, preserved in a series of obscure Near Eastern folk tales, describes a custom in which the first stone thrown should be small, almost symbolic, meant to invite participation rather than inflict harm. Some historians argue that this detail was metaphorical, a way of expressing communal responsibility rather than literal procedure. Others suspect it may reflect practices that varied widely from one settlement to another. No one can say for certain. The stories survive like amber, holding shapes we can see but cannot fully interpret. As we settle into this twilight ring, the stones seem to lean inward, as though listening to footsteps long erased. The ground at the center feels smoother than the surrounding terrain, softened by time and repetition. In the golden haze, one might imagine a figure standing there centuries ago, breathing slowly, perhaps clutching the last warmth of the day. Around them, villagers would gather with stones already in hand, but unlike later executions, this act was not swift. It was deliberate, paced by the hesitation of each person present. No single stone carried the full weight of judgment. It was the accumulation that made the sentence final. The emotional landscape of such a moment is difficult to reconstruct. Some might have believed deeply in the justice of the act. Others may have looked away, throwing only because community expectation demanded it. In ancient village life, refusing to participate could be seen as unsettling, even dangerous, as though dissent might unravel the fragile social fabric. And so, in the dimming light, stones would rise and fall. Their impacts echoed through a silence, far more oppressive than the noise of a courtroom. The condemned would be enveloped not by one person's will, but by the gravity of many. A curious historical note emerges from a Roman-era text describing the borderlands near Judea. An observer wrote that in some communities, the stones used in executions were not to be removed afterward. Instead, they remained scattered in a rough pile, marking the site. Over time, these cairns became so prominent that travellers recognized them from a distance. Whether the stones we now imagine in this twilight ring represent such a cairn or a ritual formation is impossible to know. What matters is how they feel heavy with the residue of judgment, yet softened by nature's slow reclaiming. The moss growing along the bases of the rocks blurs their outlines, making the ring appear less like a man-made space and more like a natural phenomenon. This blending creates a gentle tension, as though time intends to obscure the past without entirely erasing it. The stones still remember the weight of hands that lifted them, the dull thud of each impact, and the final stillness that settled afterward. But they also remember countless nights like this one, quiet, undisturbed, the sky stretching wide above them. And as we noted earlier, these ancient spaces rarely belong to a single purpose. The very ring we imagine might have hosted seasonal gatherings, marriages, or communal debates during daylight hours. Only at certain moments did it shift into a place of reckoning. This duality gives it an almost mythical resonance, the sense that the land itself holds contrasting roles, merging celebration and condemnation into a single memory strata. Perhaps that is why the stones still feel watchful, waiting as twilight deepens into night. Now, as darkness begins to creep from the edges, the ring takes on another quality, something more intimate. The stones appear closer together, their shadows longer, their ancient surfaces absorbing the last glimmer of light. A faint breeze moves through the clearing, stirring dust and leaves in soft spirals. In our mind, the villagers fade into ghost-like outlines, their forms dissolving into the encroaching night. The condemned figure at the center becomes only a suggestion, a memory flickering at the threshold between presence and absence. This slow fading is not an ending but an invitation, a quiet pull toward what lies ahead. For just beyond the ring, at the edge of sight, a faint orange glow hints at embers, waiting to be stirred, an ancient fire pit where punishment once took a different form. And as we leave the ring behind, the stones seem to sink further into shadow, keeping their secrets with the same patient calm they've held for millennia. The warmth ahead beckons, though its origins are far more perilous than comforting. Something is glowing in the darkness, and the air carries the faintest scent of smoke. The Ember Throne. The first flicker appears like a shy creature emerging from the dark, a trembling orange glow, barely enough to paint a soft crescent of light across the ground. It pulses gently, as though breathing, warming the cool night air with a fragile heartbeat. As we step closer, the glow strengthens, revealing the shallow bowl of an ancient fire pit. Ash lies scattered within it like pale memory dust. Charcoal fragments cling stubbornly to the stones, as if refusing to relinquish their last traces of heat. The atmosphere here is different from the twilight ring behind us, less communal, more controlled, shaped by the deliberate hand of authority. Burning has been used as a method of execution in many corners of the world, but the version that haunts this clearing feels older, quieter, stripped of the theatrical flames that later centuries would make infamous. It is closer to the earth, closer to the hearth, not a towering blaze, but a carefully tended fire, a throne of embers. One imagines the condemned seated or positioned near its core, the heat rising in slow waves, deliberate and merciless, yet eerily subdued. History remembers the great pyres, the roaring flames of medieval Europe, the notorious burnings of heretics, the auto-da-fe. But long before any of these public spectacles, fire was already a tool of judgment. In ancient Mesopotamian texts, references appear to punishments carried out in the furnace, though scholars still debate whether these accounts describe literal executions or symbolic purification rituals. The ambiguity is telling, for fire occupies an unusual place in human memory. It destroys and transforms in equal measure. Here, in our imagined clearing, the fire pit seems to hum with that duality. The stones around it glow faintly in the night, warmed from countless earlier flames. They stand arranged in a deliberate semicircle, each one positioned to contain the heat, redirect it, concentrate it. This was not a haphazard construction. Someone long ago understood the way flames move, the way embers breathe, and built this structure to harness that knowledge. It is craftsmanship with a grim purpose. A fringe detail preserved in a tiny fragment of a medieval traveller's journal hints at a rare variation. In some remote communities of Eastern Europe, executions by fire were sometimes conducted at dusk rather than daylight. The belief was that flames burned truer, whatever that meant, when the world around them dimmed. Whether this was based on superstition, practicality, or poetic imagination, no one can say. But the idea lingers, and in the darkness of this clearing, it feels strangely plausible. As we linger beside the Ember Throne, a soft wind passes through the branches overhead. The air carries the faint scents of burnt wood and distant pine. One can almost imagine the glow intensifying, as though memory alone feeds the fire. A single ember crackles and collapses inward, sending a brief spark upward like a drifting firefly. And suddenly, the scene becomes clearer. We can envision the figure brought to this place long ago, someone accused, perhaps, of breaking an oath, or of invoking forces the village could not understand. The executioners would not have needed many tools. Fire requires little beyond patience. The condemned might have been bound lightly or not at all, depending on the severity of the sentence. Some cultures believed that if the flames refused to consume quickly, the gods were expressing doubt or mercy. Others believed the opposite, that a slow burn was the truest sign of guilt. Again, scholars still debate whether such interpretations were widely held or exaggerated by later retellings, seeking to make the ancient world seem more mystical than it was. As the embers brightened, the condemned would feel the waves of heat approach with agonizing deliberation. Not a sudden conflagration, but a creeping warmth that turned unbearable only through time. Witnesses, if any were present, would stand at a respectful distance, faces illuminated by the flickering light. Some might have murmured prayers. Others might have watched in silence, their expressions carved by the fire's shifting shadows. Compared to the communal weight of the stoning ring, this scene would have felt more intimate, less about group responsibility, more about ritual and finality. The surrounding forest, which now whispers gently as we stand here, would have held those moments with an almost reverent stillness. Even animals would sense the unease, pausing in their nocturnal wanderings as the scent of smoke drifted between the trees. The flames would rise and fall, licking at the darkness, casting long lines of light across the ground, and the figure at the center of it all would gradually disappear into that dance, absorbed by the fire's unrelenting embrace. What remains now is only the memory-blurred residue, the ash, the stones, the faint warmth that seems to persist even when no fire burns. The clearing hums with a quiet sense of completion, as though the earth itself has absorbed centuries of endings and transformed them into silence. And yet, as we look toward the edge of the clearing, something else appears to stir. A thin fissure in the ground, half hidden beneath roots and fallen leaves, hints at a deeper space below. A place where the earth opens downward, not upward. A place where punishment did not rise in flames, but slithered and hissed in the dark. A soft rustle comes from beyond the fire pit, faint but unmistakable, as though something ancient has shifted deep beneath the soil. What waits below will not warm us. It will watch from the cold shadows, coiled and patient. The serpent pit murmur. The fissure in the soil widens, as our eyes adjust to the deepening night. Its outline, barely visible beneath the tangle of roots and leaf litter. The ember glow behind us fades with each step, swallowed slowly by the surrounding darkness, until only the faint silver of moonlight guides our descent toward the pit. Here, the air cools noticeably, carrying with it an ancient dampness earth that has not seen sunlight in centuries, a chill that seems to hum from below. And beneath that hum, there is something else. A murmur, soft and steady, like scales shifting against stone. Before torches and swords defined the shape of justice, pits such as this served as grim reminders of the fears that once guided entire communities. The serpent pit is one of those stories that slips between myth and reality, whispered in the margins of early chronicles. It appears in fragments, Norse sagas that speak of prisoners hurled into snake-filled enclosures, early Indian accounts describing pits used to test divine judgment, and even later Roman gossip, coloured by political bitterness, claiming that the usurper King Ragnar Lodbrok met his end in just such a place around the mid-9th century. Though scholars still debate whether Ragnar's death truly involved serpents, or whether the tale was shaped by poetic embellishment, the image endures cold, subterranean, and unmistakably human. As we move closer, the opening of the pit becomes clearer, reinforced by stones carefully placed long ago. Their arrangement suggests planning, not accident. A ring of granite fitted tightly enough to retain its shape even now. Moss clings to their lower edges, and small ferns lean inward as if drawn to the darkness. A faint exhale rises from the hollow cool, moist, unsettlingly alive. The murmur grows slightly louder, though its source remains entirely unseen. In the dimness, one can picture how this pit must have looked centuries earlier. Torches would have flickered around its rim, casting shifting stripes of light into the depths. Villagers or warbands would gather in a cautious arc, keeping distance from the edge out of instinct more than etiquette. And somewhere nearby, a prisoner hands bound, shoulders slumped, would wait under guard, listening for the first hiss that signaled the serpents below. The use of animals in punishment is as old as myth itself, but snake pits occupy a unique place in that timeline. They are neither purely symbolic nor entirely practical. Serpents, revered and feared across cultures, embody a certain ambiguity. Some brought luck, others carried omens. Their venom could be both medicine and executioner. Thus, a pit filled with them became more than a tool. It became a boundary between the living world and something older, something primal. The condemned were not merely killed. They were delivered into the realm of creatures believed to communicate with gods and underworlds. One fringe tradition, recorded in an obscure Slavic codex, claims that certain serpent pits were not meant to kill outright. Instead, a single non-venomous snake, large, old, almost ceremonial, would be kept alongside smaller venomous species. Its presence was said to represent judgment, guiding the lesser snakes toward guilt or away from innocence. Whether this was a ritual invention, a storyteller's flourish, or an echo of some lost belief, scholars still debate, but even imagining it sends a subtle shiver through the dark. As we peer into the pit, the moon shifts behind a passing cloud, dimming what little light we had. For a moment, we see nothing but blackness, thick and absolute. Then, slowly, the outline of the pit's interior begins to emerge. Smooth stones form its vertical walls. Roots dangle like pale fingers from the edges. And beneath them, in the farthest reaches of shadow, something stirs. It is impossible to tell whether it is a living creature or simply moisture preparing to drip. Yet the sound is unmistakable. A slow drag, a soft coil, a whisper of scales. One can imagine the terror of those lowered into this place. The prisoner's feet would touch the cold stone first, hesitant, searching for stability. Breath would become tight, shallow. Any hint of movement in the darkness would trigger an immediate flinch. There were cases mentioned briefly in early Roman accounts where the condemned survived the first minutes, or even hours, avoiding the serpents by pressing themselves into corners or feigning stillness. But the pit offered no lasting refuge. Hunger, movement, the shifting of the night, all of it conspired to bring the inevitable. And above them, the watchers would wait. Some might murmur prayers. Others would stare in rigid silence. Serpent pits were rarely about spectacle. Unlike fire or hanging, this method required patience from both the condemned and the observers. There was no precise moment of finality. The pit was a slow verdict, delivered in pieces, first a hiss, then a strike, then silence. Now, as the moon emerges again, a faint glimmer reflects off something below. For just an instant, it looks like a narrow curve, smooth, pale, slipping between stones. But the light shifts too quickly to confirm. Whatever moves in the pit retreats once more into darkness, leaving only the lingering sense that we have been observed in return. The roots around the rim sway slightly as the night breeze deepens. The ember glow in the clearing behind us has faded entirely, replaced by the cool breath rising from the earth. And the pit, with its patient murmuring, seems to beckon us to lean closer, to listen to the echoes of all it once consumed. Yet some instinct, ancient, primal, tells us to step back. There are places where even memory feels dangerous, and this seems to be one of them. The darkness here is not empty. It is occupied, attentive, waiting for a disturbance. As we withdraw into the safety of the trees, the murmuring fades, but does not vanish. It lingers like a soft warning, following us as we ascend the slight rise toward a different kind of judgment. Ahead, a shallow pool gleams beneath the moonlight, its surface unbroken, calm, reflective, deceptively gentle. Still water, after all, can be just as unforgiving as fangs. Water's unforgiving mirror. The path from the serpent pit rises gently, leading us toward a hush so complete it feels almost ceremonial. Here, the night opens into a small basin, cupped by low banks of grass and stone. At its center rests a pool still, dark, and unnervingly calm. Moonlight lays a thin silver ribbon across its surface, unbroken by ripple or breeze, transforming the water into a perfect mirror. It reflects not just the shapes above it, but the quiet itself, as though time slows the nearer we draw to its edge. This is no river, no rushing torrent. It is a place chosen precisely for its stillness, a place where footsteps soften before they reach the waterline, where breath seems to hover rather than disperse. The surface appears shallow at first glance, but the darkness suggests a depth one cannot measure by sight alone. The pool feels as though it listens patiently, without judgment, and yet history remembers it as an instrument of judgment nonetheless. Water, for all its gentleness, has long served as both life and peril. Before empires codified their laws, before cities paved their streets, communities turned to water when they sought answers from forces unseen, perhaps because it reflected the sky, or because it concealed what lay beneath, or because it could cradle and suffocate with equal ease. In this clearing, the pool's presence suggests an ancient form of ordeal, a method less violent in appearance, yet no less final. One of the earliest written references to such practices appears from ancient Mesopotamia around the 2nd millennium BCE, in the form of the river ordeal. A person accused of serious wrongdoing might be cast into a river to determine guilt. Survival indicated innocence, while drowning confirmed guilt. But those records speak of flowing water, currents that swept away the condemned. Here, the stillness changes everything. Submersion in water without current becomes something more intimate, more deliberate. Scholars still debate whether smaller, ritualized pools like this were used for local judgments or for purification rites that later hardened into execution practices. Yet the spacing of stones along the bank, smooth, evenly placed, suggests human intention, perhaps ritual preparation. At the edge of the pool, the air grows cooler. The faintest hint of mist rises from the water, drifting like breath from an invisible mouth. One can imagine villagers gathering here under torchlight, their reflections trembling on the surface. A hush would settle over them, distinct from the silence of fear, more like the quiet before a prayer. The accused might stand barefoot at the margin, the soil damp beneath their skin, listening to the gentle but insistent requests of the elders. In some traditions, the condemned were gently lowered into the water, their arms bound loosely. In others, they stepped in voluntarily, as if offering themselves to the pool's judgment. There are accounts obscure, barely mentioned in regional folklore, of such pools considered truth wells, used to test whether someone carried a curse or concealed misdeeds. A curious fringe detail notes that certain pools were believed to reject the innocent by buoying them to the surface, though this logic reversed the later European witch trial notion that floating marked guilt. Whether these beliefs were rooted in real practice or were symbolic attempts to explain outcomes, scholars still debate. The moonlight deepens as a cloud drifts past, casting the pool into momentary darkness. Without the silver sheen, the water becomes a void, silent, unlit, unfathomable. Standing at its edge, one feels a faint unease, not from any visible danger, but from the sense that the water holds more memory than it reveals. Perhaps this is why such pools were chosen. They do not resist, do not roar, do not accuse. They simply receive. Imagine, for a moment, the final steps of a condemned figure approaching this mirror. The villagers hold their torches low, the flames dancing subtly across the surface. The figure's reflection trembles, then stabilizes, as though the water steadies its breath in anticipation. A rope around the torso, or sometimes none at all. A whispered blessing from an elder, or a curse, depending on the crime. Then, slowly, the water closes around the ankles, the knees, the waist. The cold would be immediate, stealing breath in an instant, and yet the condemned might not struggle at first. Some believed that if they surrendered, the water would yield, carrying them gently, revealing innocence. Others knew the outcome was predetermined by those watching, and their stillness became a final attempt at dignity. The pool accepted both kinds of surrender in the same quiet embrace. A witness might have leaned in, listening for the soft gasp that followed the first full submersion. The faintest ripple would spread outward, only to vanish against the rim, where stones kept the boundary fixed. And as minutes stretched into what must have felt like hours, the pool would maintain its reflection of the sky, even as life slipped from the form beneath. When all movement ceased, the villagers would approach with reverence. The water, in their eyes, had spoken. They would retrieve the body carefully, laying it upon a cloth or simple bedding, their torches flickering over pale skin. The air, thick with moisture, would seem to tighten around them, as though the forest itself held its breath. Now, centuries later, the pool has become only a shape in the land. The rituals are gone, the judgments forgotten. Leaves drift across its surface, small birds approach its edge to drink. In daylight, it might look like any other quiet recess in the forest, but at night, under the silver gaze of the moon, it retains a certain gravity. The surface still appears too calm, too watchful, as though something within it remembers every face reflected before being swallowed by its depths. A gentle rustle stirs the reeds at the far edge, perhaps only a frog shifting position, or a night bird passing low. But the sound breaks the spell, reminding us that the clearing is alive, even as the pool remains eerily still. We turn away at last, leaving the water's silent judgment behind us. The path ahead leads toward wooden posts, tall, weathered, catching slivers of moonlight. Their shapes rise like skeletal sentinels, pointing toward a history etched not into water, but into timber. And somewhere in that grain, another ancient method waits like a memory refusing to sleep. The stake of quiet winds. The wooden posts rise slowly from the darkness as we leave the still pool behind, their silhouettes emerging like faint brushstrokes against the night sky. At first they seem like nothing more than remnants of some forgotten structure, perhaps the ribs of an old fence or the supports of a shelter long collapsed. But as we step closer, the truth begins to settle around us with the same quiet certainty carried by the evening breeze. These posts were meant to hold, to bind, to witness. They are not part of what once stood here. They are what stood here. Each stake leans slightly, contoured by decades, perhaps centuries of wind. Their surfaces are smooth in places and cracked in others, bearing the long, pale scars of weather and time. Even now, in their stillness, one senses the faint tension of old ropes pulled taut against them, rope fibers digging into wood, wood resisting. There is a softness to the air here, a whisper of wind brushing against the posts, as though continuing a conversation begun long ago. Execution by stake impalement, binding, exposure took numerous forms across cultures. But the posts that stand here suggest a quieter variant, one shaped less by spectacle and more by solemn utility. The most common association may be with burning, yet this clearing holds no scorch marks, no remains of pyres. Instead, the stakes are spaced at measured intervals, each positioned with a precision that speaks of method, not frenzy. This place was constructed for restraint, not flame. Long before medieval Europe transformed the stake into a symbol of religious persecution, earlier societies used it in simpler, harsher ways. In ancient Persia, around the 5th century BCE, for instance, offenders might be tied to a post for days left to thirst, to exposure, to the slow erosion of life beneath unrelenting sun or wind. Though impalement grabs more attention in modern retellings, binding to a stake was far more common and far more varied. Some communities used it as an ordeal, others as punishment, still others as a final act of exclusion. Scholars still debate whether certain Persian punishments described in Greek accounts were exaggerated or misunderstood, coloured by cultural suspicion. But the stake itself remains a universal shape, simple, immutable, merciless. As we draw nearer to the first post, the texture becomes clearer. It carries faint indentations in vertical patterns, as though rope once pressed deeply over and over again. The knots themselves are gone, but their memory remains in the wood. Moss climbs partway up the base, blurring the boundary between earth and timber. A small beetle traces a slow path along the grain, oblivious to the human weight this structure once bore. One can imagine the ritual unfolding here in the dim glow of torchlight. The condemned, perhaps a thief, a deserter, someone who refused an oath, would be brought forward with hands bound. There would have been no need for shouting, no dramatic proclamations. The wind would carry enough sound on its own, swirling around the stakes like a silent chorus. The executioners, likely few in number, would move with practiced efficiency. Binding was a measured craft, too tight, and the limbs would numb too quickly, too loose, and the prisoner might attempt escape. Precision mattered. Some fringe accounts from Central Asia describe stakes deliberately positioned to face east, so that the condemned would see the sunrise, whether or not they lived to witness its full light. Others claim that certain communities left small offerings, grains, herbs, even carved tokens at the base of the post, as though acknowledging the ambiguous boundary between justice and cruelty. Scholars still debate whether these details reflect widespread customs or isolated practices magnified by later storytellers seeking poetry and punishment. Yet as we stand here in the night breeze, the idea feels oddly fitting. The wind carries the scent of pine and earth, as if it has passed through countless seasons of vigil. The condemned would remain tied as the hours stretched on. Exposure was not a swift end, it was patient, almost contemplative in its cruelty. The chill of night seeped into the bones. Hunger clawed slowly. The wind, gentle now, but perhaps sharper in earlier centuries, pressed against the skin, tugged at hair and clothing, whispered through the grass at their feet, and overhead, stars turned with steadfast indifference, watching the slow unravelling of human endurance. Unlike the fire's sudden hunger or the snake pit's unpredictable menace, the stake offered no distraction. Nothing moved except the wind, nothing changed except the light. The condemned stood or sagged, alone with their thoughts. Those who waited nearby, whether guards or villagers, would keep a quiet vigil, their torches casting long shadows across the clearing. Perhaps they whispered to each other. Perhaps they did not. In places like this, silence feels less like an absence and more like a presence, something with weight and texture. As we noted earlier, ancient methods often blended practical necessity with ritual undertones, and the stake is no exception. Some cultures saw it as a final chance for confession. Others viewed it as symbolic isolation, a physical removal from the community long before life itself ceased. In certain tribal traditions, birds were believed to carry the souls of the dying. An exposure at a stake allowed those spirits to be taken swiftly into the sky. Whether people truly believed this or merely hoped it was so, scholars still debate. But such beliefs underscore how even the harshest punishments were entangled with ideas of the afterlife, fate, and cosmic order. Now, the stakes stand empty. The ropes have crumbled into dust. The wind passes between them with a sigh that might once have been mistaken for a voice. Moonlight catches on the splintered tops, giving them a soft halo. They look less like instruments of suffering and more like aged guardians, keeping watch over a history they no longer enact. We move past them carefully, as though not to disturb the quiet they preserve. Beyond the last post, the ground slopes downward, gathering faint shadows between the rocks. A heavier stillness settles there, dense and unmoving, as though weighed down by something hidden. The air thickens, and for a moment, the wind holds its breath. Ahead lies a place where pressure, not rope, not flame, not water, cast the final verdict. A place where silence itself became the crushing force. Just beyond the stakes, the darkness deepens. The crushing silence. The ground slopes gently downward, as though guiding us into a hollow where sound itself becomes hesitant. Each step softens underfoot. The night air, once stirred by the wind threading between the stakes behind us, now settles into a heavier stillness, dense, almost tangible. It is the kind of silence that collects in enclosed places, beneath overhangs, within shallow ravines, or in pits shaped not by nature, but by human intention. Ahead, a cluster of broad, flat stones sits low to the earth, arranged with a symmetry that feels deliberate rather than accidental. These stones rest like ancient tablets laid out for a ceremony long forgotten. Their surfaces, smooth and cool under the moonlight, reflect faint glints where grains of quartz catch the silver glow. At first glance, they seem like markers, perhaps burial slabs, perhaps foundations of something lost. But as we move closer, their true purpose begins to whisper through the quiet. Each stone forms part of a pattern. One large slab on the ground, another positioned beside it, and a third that looks as though it once lay atop a body placed between the two. This is the place of pressing the slow, methodical crushing of the human frame beneath weight and time. Many know the later version from English history, the peine forte et dure, used in the 17th and 18th centuries to compel confessions or pleas, most famously in the case of Giles Corey in 1692. But long before such cases entered courts and chronicles, pressing existed in more rudimentary forms across ancient landscapes. In villages and tribal communities where resources were scarce and tools limited, the weight of stones became a primal verdict. The body could be immobilized with minimal means, and the earth provided all that was needed to create unbearable pressure. The stones before us seem to echo that primal logic. Their shapes are not the sharp rectangular cuts of later architecture. Instead, they bear the contours of river-worn boulders and weathered slabs, their edges rounded, their surfaces polished by centuries of rain. The method here was likely simple, brutal, and eerily quiet. A condemned person accused perhaps of theft, treason, or refusing an oath would be laid upon the lower stone, their limbs extended or pinned by smaller rocks. Then, gradually, additional stones would be placed atop the chest or abdomen, one by one, each adding its own measured weight. The process could take hours, sometimes longer, There was no sudden impact, no dramatic gesture, only pressure constant, patient, unyielding. One fringe detail, preserved in a remote alpine folktale, describes villagers whispering apologies to the condemned before placing each stone, believing that acknowledging the weight somehow eased the passing. Whether such rituals were common or merely the invention of one isolated community, scholars still debate. Yet the concept resonates here, in this hollow where the stones sit like mute witnesses, holding the memory of slow, deliberate choices. We step nearer to the central slab. Its surface is cool and smooth, almost unnervingly so, as though countless bodies once warmed it only to leave no mark behind. A shallow indentation dips toward the center, not deep enough to be a carving, but perhaps formed over years of weight applied repeatedly to the same place. The stone remembers. Even if no human record survives, the ground beneath it has been shaped by the gravity of history. In the quiet, it becomes easy to reconstruct the scene. Torches, dim and wavering, night insects buzzing in hesitant patterns, a small cluster of people standing at the perimeter, unsure where to rest their gaze. The condemned lying on the slab, breath shallow but steady, waiting for the first weight to descend. Perhaps there were murmured prayers, some for mercy, some for justice, some for courage. And then, the first stone placed atop the chest, heavy enough to restrict breath, light enough to avoid immediate collapse. The silence would thicken as the method unfolded. Unlike hanging or the serpent pit, pressing required no dramatic action, no spectacle to draw attention. It could occur at night with only a handful of witnesses, each stone placed with slow deliberation, each breath becoming shallower, each heartbeat pushing against an increasing burden. As we noted earlier with the stake, some punishments embraced a strange, ritualistic patience. Pressing magnified that tension. It was not only an end, it was an attempt to extract something. A confession, a plea, a name. Some ancient societies believed that the soul revealed truth when pressed, as though physical force compelled spiritual confession. Others used pressing solely as punishment, not interrogation. The historical record is inconsistent, and scholars still debate how widespread each interpretation was. A faint breeze finds its way into the hollow now, stirring leaves near the stones. The sound is soft, almost a sigh, but it reminds us that the world continues to breathe even in places shaped by suffocation. Overhead, the moon slides behind a drifting veil of clouds, dimming the clearing further. The stones lose some of their sheen, blending more fully into shadow. They appear heavier now, as though the darkness itself adds weight. There is something achingly human about the method. Its cruelty lies not in spectacle but in slowness, in the incremental nature of suffering. A single stone means little, 2 stones less than a weapon. But add enough, and even granite becomes a sentence. The earth participates in the act, not through violence, but through gravity, the very force that binds us to the world. We linger a moment longer, feeling the hush settle into our bones. The clearing feels suspended in time, caught between memory and silence. But just beyond the stones, the path rises again toward a faint metallic glimmer. Moonlight catches on a narrow edge, a blade, perhaps, resting in the imagination's periphery. It glints like a watchful eye, an invitation into a different kind of cold judgment. The crushing silence recedes behind us. Ahead, something sharper waits in the moonlit dark. Blades that never spoke. The moon slips from behind a bank of slow-moving clouds, just as the path levels out, revealing a narrow shimmer ahead, thin, unwavering, metallic. At first it seems like a stray reflection, a trick of silvered light glancing off dew. But as we step nearer, the shape clarifies. A blade lies partially embedded in the earth, its surface glinting softly, as though still polished by hands long gone. It is not a weapon left in haste. It is positioned with intention, angled upright, like a tool laid out for a ritual rather than for combat. The clearing opens into a long, low space bordered by stones and short posts, perhaps once supporting a canopy or marking the boundaries of a ceremonial ground. The earth here is unnervingly flat, as though swept smooth for repeated use. A faint chill lingers above it, not the damp cold of water, nor the deep cold of subterranean hollows, but the thin, dry coolness of sharpened metal. Execution by blade spans nearly every civilization on record, from the sleek efficiency of Japanese beheading rituals to the ceremonial axes of ancient Germania. But the scene here feels older, stripped of the ornate pageantry that later ages layered upon the act. This place whispers of a time when a single blade, steady and unadorned, carried out sentences without spectacle. No great platform, no drumbeat, no gathered throng. Only a boundary of stones, the steady hand of the executioner, and the quiet descent of steel. The blade before us leans slightly, its hilt buried deep in the soil. Its shape is simple broad near the base, tapering toward a honed edge. The metal shows only the faintest traces of rust, as though protected by ritual care or forged from an alloy resistant to decay. It is easy to imagine someone sharpening it under torchlight, dragging stone along metal in slow, deliberate strokes, each sound echoing across the quiet clearing. One of the earliest detailed accounts of beheading as a method of execution comes from ancient Greece, around the 5th century BCE, where it was considered a relatively honorable death compared to more torturous alternatives. But older, scattered references hint that the practice existed far earlier, woven into tribal customs across Europe, Asia, and the Near East. A fringe note from a remote Anatolian text even claims that the executioner's shadow should not fall upon the victim at the moment of the blade's descent, an omen associated with a soul's unrest. Whether this was widespread belief or poetic instruction, scholars still debate. Standing here, the quiet is profound. The wind has softened to a faint thread, weaving between stones. The blade stands like a sentinel, awaiting purpose. Though no executioner is present, the clearing feels as though he might step into view at any moment, calm, methodical, neither cruel nor kind, simply carrying the weight of tradition. Imagine the ritual as it once unfolded. The condemned would be led into the clearing, sometimes with hands bound, sometimes with hands free as a gesture of dignity. They might be offered water or allowed a final word, though many historical records suggest these gestures varied widely from culture to culture. The executioner would step forward, blade in hand, moving with a clarity of intent shaped by years of practice. There was no hurried swing. Contrary to dramatic retellings, seasoned executioners valued precision over force. A single, clean strike required alignment, angle, and the calmest of hands. Even the condemned's posture mattered, and they might be instructed to kneel at a precise point where the ground was firm and level. The silence around them became part of the ritual the moment before the blade fell. It was a moment suspended in time, as though the world held its breath. As we noted earlier in the crushing silence of the stone slabs, some methods relied on slow pressure. Here, the force is sudden, immediate, yet the stillness surrounding it softens even that violence. Witnesses, if present at all, would stand just outside the ring of stones, watching with solemn focus. Some might turn away at the last moment, others might stare straight ahead, believing the moment to be swift enough to avoid lingering in the mind. The blade would descend in a single arc, a whisper of metal through air. A dull sound, never as sharp as one might imagine, followed by the finality of motion ended. In some cultures, the head was lifted as a sign of completion. In others, it was left where it fell, untouched until the witnesses dispersed. This clearing feels like a place of the latter tradition, a setting where silence mattered more than ceremony. The executioner, in this imagined past, would clean the blade with measured care. Water, cloth, perhaps even sand, to scour stubborn traces from the edge. Tools were precious. A blade that served judgment was treated with respect, not revulsion. In some communities, it was believed that a well-kept executioner's blade prevented wandering spirits from clinging to the metal. Whether this belief held spiritual weight or simply encouraged maintenance, scholars still debate. The night air shifts faintly, drawing our attention toward the far end of the clearing. A subtle trail of disturbed earth leads away from the blade, edging into darker terrain shaped by wind and drifting sand. The ground dips there, forming shallow furrows that resemble footprints partially erased by time. Beyond lies a different kind of execution ground, one where the earth itself, not metal, served as the instrument of fate. A place where bodies were swallowed rather than cut, where silence deepened into burial. The blade glints once more as a cloud slips past the moon, then settles into stillness. Behind us, the crushing silence of the stone slabs lingers like a memory. Ahead, the desert's breath waits dry, quiet, and patient. And somewhere within that dryness, something lies buried, just beneath the shifting sands. The desert burials. The first breath of the desert reaches us as a faint, warm exhale, dry, grainy, carrying the scent of distant dunes and sun-baked stone. It rolls softly across the path, as though sifting through centuries before touching our skin. The clearing of blades fades behind us, swallowed by the whisper of shifting sand. Ahead, the landscape opens into a wide, pale expanse, where moonlight collects in thin silver sheets atop the ground. Even at night, the desert seems to glow from within, as though storing sunlight deep beneath its surface. And there, just beyond a low ridge of wind-shaped earth, lies a shallow depression so subtle it might be overlooked, if not for the faint outline of stones encircling it. They are half buried now, their edges softened by time. Only the tips protrude, forming a broken ring like the remnants of an ancient sundial. The sand slopes inward at the centre, forming a hollow where the grains appear slightly darker, as though packed and disturbed over countless years. This place feels vast yet intimate. The sky stretches open above us, wide and silent, unclouded. Stars shimmer like cold embers across its face. The desert absorbs sound with uncanny gentleness. No trees rustle here, no insects hum, no water laps at the shore. Only sand moves slowly, imperceptibly sliding across itself with a soft sigh. It is a quiet deep enough to echo. Desert burial as a form of execution appears sporadically throughout early histories, far less recorded than hanging or beheading, yet mentioned often enough to suggest a wide but understated presence. In some nomadic cultures, burial in sand, partial or complete, served as a punishment for betrayal or sacrilege. There are scattered references from the ancient Near East, including a Babylonian legal fragment hinting at offenders placed beneath the weight of earth. Scholars still debate whether these texts describe literal burial or symbolic language for abandonment. The ambiguity only adds to the desert's mysterious weight. We step closer to the depression. The sand shifts beneath our feet with a soft crunch, sinking slightly, as though memory lies hidden beneath its surface. The stones around the ring bear faint carvings lines too eroded to decipher, curves that might once have formed symbols or simple boundary markers. Sand fills the grooves, smoothing them, erasing the edges of meaning. Time here is relentless, sculpting and consuming in equal measure. Imagine the scene centuries ago. A caravan trail not far from here. A group of figures assembled at dawn or dusk, when the heat was bearable and shadows stretched long across the dunes. The condemned hands bound loosely, ankles roped, would be brought to the ring. There was little ceremony. The desert did not require it. The environment alone carried more quiet authority than any human decree. Some methods were swift. The prisoner placed in a shallow pit, sand shoveled over them until only the head remained exposed. The sun completed the sentence. Other methods were slow: partial burial, binding, abandonment. The desert itself became the executioner. Dry air stealing moisture, sand abrading skin, sun pressing down with unwavering weight. And at night, the cold would descend suddenly, the stars burning with indifferent clarity above. A fringe account from a lost Berber chronicle describes a peculiar custom. The condemned might be given a single cup of water before burial, not as mercy, but as a symbolic gesture acknowledging the desert's ownership. The idea was that the land took back what it lent, and the final drink completed a cycle. Scholars still debate whether this detail reflects real practice or the poetic imagination of a wandering scribe, yet the image lingers, delicate and haunting. Kneeling at the edge of the depression, we can almost sense the shifting boundaries of the ancient pit. Sand clings loosely to itself, and a faint breeze stirs grains in spirals. The desert feels alive, not in the way forests pulse with hidden creatures, but in the way oceans breathe vast, elemental, unknowable. This execution ground would have required minimal human intervention. Those who performed the sentence might depart long before life actually faded. The desert needed no audience, and perhaps that is what makes this method so unsettling. There is no immediate act of violence, no decisive moment. The condemned is left between earth and sky, caught in the slow dialogue between sun and sand. Silence deepens with every passing hour. Thoughts stretch into the horizon. Time distorts. The world narrows to heat and thirst, then widens suddenly to the immensity above. It is an end shaped not by tools, but by nature's vast indifference. As earlier sections have reminded us, many ancient methods were intertwined with ritual. Desert burial is one of the few where ritual seems minimal, almost absent. Nature performs the final rites. The land itself becomes both grave and witness. The only human imprint is the ring of stones markers, perhaps, or guides for those who knew where to return. Now, the stones tilt at odd angles, half swallowed by drifting dunes. The depression deepens and shallows with each windstorm. What remains is not a fixed site, but a shifting memory, like breath on a mirror, here and gone. A sudden gust sweeps across the basin, lifting a fine veil of sand into the air. It swirls briefly, catching the moonlight like pale smoke, then drifts away. The moment feels almost like a whisper, an echo of a voice long buried. We rise slowly, brushing sand from our hands, and look toward the horizon. There, a metallic glimmer breaks the desert's monotony. At first it appears like a star fallen to earth, but as we walk, the shape solidifies. Bronze, curved, ancient, unmistakably crafted. The desert gives way to something forged by human hands, something that once held heat and screams and the echo of hollow thunder. Beyond the dunes, the bronze embrace awaits. The bronze embrace. The metallic glimmer grows clearer with each step, rising from the desert's edge like a half-buried relic catching the moonlight. At first it appears no larger than a pot or shield, but as we draw nearer, the curve expands, arching upward in a gleaming sweep of ancient craftsmanship. Sand clings to its lower edges, softening the lines where metal meets earth. The surface bronze unmistakably holds a patina that seems to shift with the night, glowing warm in some places, dull in others, as if the object itself remembers the heat it once held. We stand before it now, a hollow bronze shell, shaped with uncanny smoothness, large enough to hold a body. Its mouth gapes slightly open, the hinges worn but still visible, like eyelids caught mid-blink. A faint breeze whispers across its interior, producing a low hum that trembles in the quiet air. It is an echo of what this object once commanded, echoes amplified, distorted, turned into something far more terrible. The bronze bull is infamous in later retellings, but the idea of execution within heated metal existed long before Greek tradition gave it its name and shape. Still, the most enduring story centers on Phalaris of Acragas in the 6th century BCE, where a craftsman named Perillos is said to have constructed a hollow bronze bull that turned human screams into animal bellows. Whether the tale is literal truth or ancient propaganda, scholars still debate. Some argue that the acoustic description was exaggerated, others that the bull was never truly used. Yet here, in this moonlit clearing at the desert's edge, the presence of a bronze shell, perhaps not shaped like a bull, perhaps simpler, more primal, suggests that the concept may have taken many forms. The embrace, as we might call it, was a terrifying paradox. Metal, cold at night, becomes merciless when fed flame. The structure before us was designed to contain both heat and sound. Its interior surface curves inward, smooth and unforgiving, without corners or seams. One can imagine the condemned being placed inside, the door sealed, the metal cool against skin cool only for a moment. Then fire kindled beneath, slowly, deliberately, the bronze warming with a gradualness that must have filled the occupant with creeping dread. We kneel and peer into the hollow. The moonlight catches the inner walls, revealing faint scorch marks, thin, dark streaks, subtle but undeniable. Nothing else remains inside, no ash, no bone. Metal forgets nothing, but it also leaves few traces of what it has witnessed. The emptiness feels deceptive, like a stage after the actors have long departed. The silence inside is heavy, dense, expectant. Imagine the ritual as it once unfolded. The executioners, perhaps only a small group, would stack wood beneath the bronze shell, arranging kindling with practiced hands. The condemned would be guided into the chamber, perhaps protesting, perhaps silent. The door would close with a dull metallic thud. The hinges might groan softly, echoing inside the hollow. Those outside would gather at a distance. Not too close, the heat would become intense. Flames would be lit, catching slowly, then growing in confidence, licking the metal's underside. The air inside the chamber would warm swiftly. Breath would grow short. The metal would radiate heat in all directions, turning the confined space into an oven. Ancient accounts say the screams were transformed by the shape of the chamber. Some writings claim they emerged like music, others like animal roars. Whether this acoustic phenomenon was real or embellished, scholars still debate, but the psychological impact of such claims remains undeniable. The idea of suffering turned into spectacle, sound shaped into symbolism. And yet, here, under this quiet desert sky, the bronze shell feels less theatrical than the legends suggest. There is no grand bull's head, no horned silhouette. This chamber is simpler, oval, rounded, functional. It suggests a method less about performance and more about containment. A grim tool of uniform heat and inescapable space. Whatever stories survive from antiquity may have been embroidered with time, but the essence remains. Heat, confinement, silence growing into something unbearable. A fringe detail, mentioned only in a fragmentary text from the Hellenistic period, describes executioners placing fragrant herbs among the kindling, not as kindness, but to mask the scent of burning flesh. Whether such practices were common, or whether the chronicler sought to add a veneer of ritual to an otherwise brutal act, remains uncertain. Scholars still debate the fragment's reliability, but even imagining it sends a faint shiver into the desert air. We rise and circle slowly around the bronze shell. The wind brushes grains of sand against its surface, creating a soft, whispering hiss. The moon reflects unevenly across its curved face, making it appear to breathe. Heat is long gone, but memory lingers. Heat has a way of imprinting itself onto metal deeper than any inscription. The clearing is quiet except for the soft shifting of sand. The desert behind us seems to hold its breath. The metal before us holds its silence. One feels, for a moment, the weight of all the voices once trapped inside, their echoes now dissolved into the night. And yet the desert wind carries something else, something thin, high, almost musical. At first it seems like wind whistling across the bronze opening, but as we listen more closely, the tone shifts, wavering, trembling, fading into a faint ringing that tugs at memory. Sound becomes a thread that leads us onward. Through a low rock passage at the edge of the clearing, a small alcove comes into view, stone-walled, torch-shaped, ancient, and at its center sits a simple wooden cup, resting on a carved pedestal, as though waiting for someone to lift it beneath the flickering shadows of judgment. The bronze grows quiet behind us, as we step toward the place where poison once masqueraded as civility. The trial of poisoned calm. The rock passage narrows before opening into a chamber, so still it feels preserved in a breath. The air changes as we step inside, cooler, smoother, as though filtered through centuries of undisturbed quiet. The walls curve inward, shaped by human hands into a shallow dome. Their surfaces hold faint traces of soot, suggesting that torches once burned here in controlled, flickering patterns. The stone underfoot is polished by age, its sheen the result of countless footsteps taken with reverence or dread. At the center of this alcove stands a pedestal carved from a single block of limestone, its edges softened by time. Resting upon it is a wooden cup, simple in form, darkened by age and perhaps by something more. Even from a distance, it draws the eye. Its smallness is almost unsettling, in contrast to the heavy shadows surrounding it, as though the most quiet and unassuming things often hold the deepest consequences. This place does not feel like an execution ground. It feels like a courtroom disguised as a sanctuary. Poison used not in secret, but in ritual, occupies a peculiar place in ancient justice. It appears most famously in Athens in 399 BCE, when Socrates drank a cup of hemlock prepared according to Athenian law. Yet controlled poison trials existed long before and long after that moment, in forms far subtler than history's grand narratives suggest. Some communities administered toxins not as punishment but as judgment, believing the body would reveal guilt by its reaction. Others saw poison as a dignified alternative to violent ends. Scholars still debate which practices were rooted in law, which in superstition, and which in quiet pragmatism. The cup before us seems to belong to that ambiguity. It is not ornate, no engravings, no precious metals, just smooth, dark wood oak, perhaps carved with care but without flourish. Its lip is thin, its shape is balanced. It is the kind of vessel made for consistency, not ceremony. That alone suggests its former role was not theatrical. It was functional, measured, methodical. A faint echo hangs in the chamber, as if footsteps from long ago reverberate softly through the stone. One can imagine how a trial might have unfolded here. Torches lining the walls, elders or judges seated in a half-circle, the accused standing before the pedestal, their shadow trembling slightly in the flickering light. The poison, whatever form it took, would be prepared nearby, perhaps out of sight but never out of mind. Some ancient traditions favoured hemlock, others used aconite, oleander, or mixtures whose recipes were fiercely guarded. A fringe detail found in a scattered collection of early Anatolian notes claims that certain communities mixed venom from small desert snakes with herbal extracts, creating a poison, both swift and eerily serene, causing a gradual numbness that spread from fingertips inward. Whether this blend truly existed or was the invention of a travelling scribe, scholars still debate. But here, in this quiet alcove, the idea feels almost plausible. The condemned or the accused, depending on the ritual, would lift the cup with both hands. The room would fall silent, no chains, no struggle. The moment itself was the judgment. If it was a trial, some believed the guilty would show symptoms quicker. If it was a sentence, the outcome was fixed long before the cup touched the lips. Yet either way, the atmosphere carried a strange gentleness, as though the ritual sought not to inflict terror, but to soften the threshold between life and whatever lay beyond. The wooden cup seems to hold that gentleness even now. We step closer, and the air seems to shift just slightly, as though disturbed by memory rather than movement. The cup's surface reveals faint cracks, the kind that form after years of absorbing moisture. One imagines how it was cleaned after each use, rinsed with water from a nearby spring, dried carefully, placed back on the pedestal to await the next verdict. Tools like this were not discarded. They were maintained with the same devotion one gives to ritual instruments. The person who drank from it would feel the effects gradually. First a warmth in the stomach, then a cooling in the extremities. Breath slowing, thoughts drifting. Ancient accounts often describe the experience in strangely serene terms, as though poison were not an act of violence, but a quiet escort across the final threshold. Of course, not all poisons acted gently. Some brought convulsions, paralysis, or terror. But in this chamber, where the stone walls embrace sound with such softness, it is easy to imagine the preference for calm toxins, those that allowed dignity, silence, perhaps even acceptance. As we noted earlier when touching upon the rituals of the stake, ancient methods often intertwined justice, spirituality, and symbolism. Poison trials were no exception. Some communities believed the cup itself held power that it absorbed guilt or truth. There were whispered superstitions that the vessel must be carved during a specific moon phase, or that its first use determined its future nature. Whether these beliefs guided real practice or emerged as later folklore shaped by fear, scholars still debate. The cup sits motionless now, bathed in moonlight filtering through a narrow opening in the ceiling. Dust dances in the beam, swirling gently like drifting incense. The silence is almost sacred. But silence in this alcove does not last. A faint vibration brushes the stone beneath our feet, subtle, rhythmic, like distant footsteps or the turning of wooden spokes. The sound is low, almost too soft to recognize at first. But as it grows, it carries a familiar pattern, a slow, creaking, circular, deliberate. Somewhere beyond the alcove, past a narrow passage leading deeper into shadow, something old turns with aching patience. A wheel, and where wheels once turned, bodies once followed. The poison calm fades behind us as we step toward the wooden groan, waiting in the dark. The wheel's slow orbit. The creaking grows clearer as we follow the narrow passage out of the poison chamber. It echoes faintly at first, soft, uncertain, like an old house settling for the night. But with each step, the sound sharpens, taking on a rhythm. A long, low groan. Then a pause. Then another. Wood against wood, wood against gravity. The sound of something heavy slowly rotating in the darkness. The corridor widens, curving slightly to the left. A faint draft brushes past us, carrying a dry, musty scent. Ancient timber, old leather, dust undisturbed for centuries. When we emerge from the passage, the night sky reappears above, framed now by a circular depression in the ground. Moonlight spills across it in a pale wash, revealing the thing at its center. A great wooden wheel, taller than a person, lying half on its side, as though exhausted from ages of turning. Its spokes stretch outward like the ribs of an enormous skeletal creature. The outer rim is reinforced with iron bands, now rusted, but still clinging stubbornly to the structure. Nearby, wooden stakes once used to tether the wheel upright still jut from the earth, worn down to splinters. The moonlight gives the scene a soft metallic sheen, turning even the shadows into delicate arcs. There is no mistaking what happened here. The wheel-breaking wheel, execution wheel, Catherine wheel has appeared in histories across Europe and beyond, most notably in the medieval and early modern eras. But the practice predates those centuries. Evidence of wheel-based punishments appears in early Roman accounts from around the 4th century CE, where criminals were tied to wagon wheels for public humiliation or worse. Whether these early accounts refer to punishment or torture, specifically leading to death, remains unclear, and scholars still debate how directly they connect to the later method of breaking bones systematically upon a wheel. What is certain is that the wheel became, over time, a symbol of prolonged suffering, ritualized violence, and an eerie blend of spectacle and silence. The wheel before us, lying gently on its side, seems almost peaceful now, but one can imagine it upright long ago, supported by the wooden stakes, turning slowly as ropes tightened or loosened to rotate the bound body. The condemned would be lashed to the wheel with arms and legs splayed across the spokes, forming a grotesque star-like shape. Executioners wielding iron bars or heavy wooden cudgels would strike strategically, breaking bones in a particular sequence intended to prolong life while rendering the body incapable of movement. A harsh method, yes, and yet, in the moonlit quiet, the details soften, taking on the hushed tone of memory rather than brutality. We move around the wheel, our footsteps muffled by the earth. The wooden surface is scarred deep grooves, where ropes once bit into the grain, shallow dents where repeated impacts left circular impressions, rust flakes from the iron bands, and drifts onto the dirt like reddish snow. A small cluster of withered plants grows through the spokes, weaving their roots through ancient gaps as though sewing the wheel back into the ground. Imagine the scene centuries ago. A crowd might gather, though not always large. The wheel was often placed outside town gates or on a hilltop, the condemned left exposed after the breaking. The process itself could last minutes or hours. As with pressing, the slowness was part of the sentence. The world would turn around the victim, the sun passing overhead, the shadows shifting inch by inch. At night, the stars would keep silent vigil, but in some versions, the turning of the wheel itself was literal. Bound to its face, the condemned might be rotated as blows were delivered, each revolution marking the rhythm of pain. The groan we heard upon approaching this clearing suggests that this wheel, too, once turned. A fringe account from a 13th century Rhineland manuscript describes a peculiar regional variation. Executioners sometimes paused between blows to whisper brief words not of comfort, but instructions to the wheel itself, commanding it to deliver justice evenly. Whether these whispers were symbolic or practical chants to maintain rhythm, scholars still debate. But here, in this quiet clearing, it is easy to imagine such murmurs floating through the night, blending with the creak of wood. The method was brutal, but also strangely ritualistic. As we noted earlier in other sections, ancient punishments often blended practicality with symbolism. The wheel, in its circular form, represented cycles' fate, justice, inevitable return. Some saw it as a cosmic instrument, turning forever. Others saw it simply as a tool of pain. The condemned, after the initial breaking, might be left upon the wheel for hours or even days. The wheel acted not only as execution device but as display public warning, moral lesson, grim monument. The wheel now lies still, half reclaimed by the earth. It no longer turns. Its spokes no longer stretch in command. And yet, standing beside it, one feels the faint echo of its past. The slow rotation, the muffled groans, the creak of timber under strain. The moon slips behind a thin veil of cloud, dimming the clearing. Shadows gather between the spokes, lengthening, merging. The atmosphere thickens, as though the wheel draws the silence inward, holding it in its hollow spaces. For a moment, the air feels heavy, pressing against the skin with a quiet insistence. But then, a glint appears at the far edge of the clearing. A different kind of metal, sharper, smaller, arranged not in circles but in rows. The moonlight returns, catching on iron points rising from the earth like a field of thorns. The wheel rests behind us, its orbit complete. Ahead lies a shape forged not for turning, but for piercing. The night deepens as we walk toward the iron garden waiting in the shadows. The iron garden. The clearing narrows into a corridor of stone and shadow before widening once more, this time into a field unlike any we have seen on our quiet journey through ancient methods. At first, the shapes rising from the earth appear like reeds or saplings, thin and dark, clustered in irregular patterns. But as the moonlight catches their edges, the truth resolves slowly, almost reluctantly. These are not plants. They are spikes, iron, weather-worn, half-buried, yet unmistakably forged by human hands. They jut from the ground at varying angles, some straight and proud, others leaning slightly as though bent by time or the weight of memory. Rust webs across their surfaces in delicate patterns, turning each spike into a fragile sculpture of decay. In the stillness, the iron seems to hum faintly, radiating a quiet, metallic chill that seeps into the surrounding soil. This is the Iron Garden. Its purpose was once far less poetic. Impalement, one of the most visceral and feared execution methods in history, has appeared across continents and eras, from Assyria to the Carpathian Basin. The version most etched into modern imagination belongs to Vlad III of Wallachia in the 15th century, whose reputation for impaling enemies along forest roads earned him both terror and legend. Yet, impalement's roots stretch back long before Vlad's era. Ancient Near Eastern inscriptions describe punishments that sound eerily similar, though scholars still debate which accounts refer to actual practice and which exaggerate royal wrath for dramatic effect. But here, in this moonlit field, the spikes do not form a line along a road or a show of royal dominance. Instead, they cluster together like a grim grove, creating an unsettling blend of order and chaos, as though nature and cruelty once danced together in the dark. We step gently between the spikes, moving slowly, careful not to disturb their precarious angles. The soil around them is uneven, mounded in places, depressed in others. Some spikes pierce upward from small pits, suggesting bodies once placed above them or, more chillingly, lowered onto them. Others emerge from stone bases, implying a deliberate positioning meant to ensure the spike remains stable under great weight. The iron catches the moonlight in thin, tremulous lines. A breeze passes through the clearing, and though the spikes do not move, the sound of wind slipping between them mimics the low whistle of breath. It is hauntingly soft, a gentle sound for such a violent history. Imagine the ritual centuries ago. A prisoner brought to the center of the garden, soldiers or villagers forming a loose perimeter. The spike sharpened to a point not too fine, not too dull, prepared with grim precision. Contrary to dramatic retellings, not all forms of impalement were meant to kill instantly. Some were designed for swiftness, others for slow, inexorable decline. The angle of the spike, the position of the body, the depth of insertion, each detail shaped the trajectory of pain. A fringe detail found in a rarely cited Byzantine commentary suggests that certain communities aligned spikes to face specific constellations during seasonal rites, believing that the soul's upward path mattered more than the body's suffering. Scholars still debate whether this refers to actual execution practices or symbolic descriptions of cosmic justice. But as we stand here beneath a sky thick with constellations, the idea feels strangely resonant. The clearing carries no stench now, only the cool breath of night. But long ago, this place would have been heavy with the scent of iron and earth. The condemned might have been hoisted by ropes, their bodies guided with chilling precision, or they might have been bound in ways that forced a slow descent onto the spike through the weight of their own flesh. The process could stretch for hours or longer depending on the method, the intention, and the mercy, or lack thereof, granted by those overseeing the sentence. And yet, for all its brutality, this iron garden feels strangely subdued. The spikes do not leer. They simply stand silent remnants of a punishment that relied as much on psychology as pain. To be placed here was to be left alone with the slow unraveling of life, surrounded by the cold sentinels of suffering past. As earlier sections have shown, ancient methods often blended terror with symbolism. The garden embodies that blend in a manner both stark and poetic. Unlike the wheel, which imposed circular fate, or the stake, which emphasized isolation, the iron garden reflects finality imposed by gravity itself. The earth pulls downward, the iron stands upward. The body is trapped between. We weave deeper into the formation, where spikes grow denser, shadows intertwine, their tips forming jagged constellations on the ground. A few spikes lie fallen, their bases rotted, as though finally surrendering after centuries of holding their vigil. Moss clings to some, others remain bare, resisting the softening touch of nature. The garden narrows again as we move forward. The spikes grow taller here, twice the height of a person, forming a corridor of iron. Their shadows reach across the path, crisscrossing like dark fingers. The air thins, not from lack of breath, but from the weight of memory pressing close. At the far end of this iron passage, the spikes pull back, creating a small open space beneath a ridge of rock. The moonlight slips in at an angle, illuminating something beyond tall, vertical silhouettes standing against the faint glow of the horizon. Their shapes are unmistakable, long poles, weathered, rising like thin horizons of suffering into the night. The garden falls silent behind us. Ahead, the sky opens into a vast, terrible vista, a field where bodies were lifted, not grounded, where the horizon itself once bore witness. The iron garden exhales its final whisper as we step toward the pierced horizon. The pierced horizon. The last of the iron spikes taper into darkness as the land rises, gently at first, then with a quiet insistence. The air shifts subtly lighter, more open, as though the night itself is bracing for the sight ahead. A faint glow lingers along the horizon, not from torchlight or fire, but from the moon cast low and wide across the earth. And silhouetted against that pale illumination are tall, narrow shapes too evenly spaced to be trees, too rigid to be natural formations. They are poles, dozens of them. Their long silhouettes pierce the sky like thin, unwavering lines drawn against the night. At a distance, they appear almost peaceful sentinels standing guard over an empty field. But as we move closer, their starkness becomes undeniable. Each pole rises from a simple stone base, anchored deeply to withstand weather and weight. The wood is darkened, not merely by age, but by the oils absorbed over countless years. Some poles lean slightly, as though bent by the passing of centuries. Others still stand perfectly upright, defying time. This place is vast, wide enough that the line of poles seems to stretch into the horizon itself. The air hums with an old tension, the kind that lingers in places where history once pressed against the sky. Crucifixion. The word is heavy, but the method is older and more varied than its most famous example. Long before the Roman Empire perfected the practice, earlier cultures used versions of suspension and exposure, binding bodies to poles or trees, leaving them between earth and sky. Yet it was the Romans who standardized the cross, making crucifixion both punishment and performance. Even then, they did not invent it. They inherited and refined it, shaping it into a tool of terror reserved for slaves, rebels, and those deemed threats to authority. Scholars still debate whether earlier Persian references to hanging on a tree indicate literal crucifixion or metaphorical execution, but by the 1st century CE, under Roman rule in regions like Judea, there is no doubt. Crucifixion had become a calculated message carved into the horizon. Here, in this quiet, moonlit field, the poles evoke that message without spectacle. They stand solitary, stripped of crossbeams perhaps long gone, perhaps never part of the design. Some ancient cultures use simple vertical stakes, binding arms overhead rather than outstretched. Others tied limbs behind the body. The exact form varied by region, by era, by intent. We approach the first pole. Its surface is rough beneath the moonlight, the grain visible even at this distance. Small iron nails poke from the wood, bent, rusted, some broken off entirely. They form irregular patterns, faint remnants of restraints that once held human weight. The ground beneath is uneven, depression and mound alternating with a subtle rhythm that suggests repeated disturbance. This was not a single execution site. It was a place of many. A faint breeze rolls across the field, brushing against the poles and producing a soft, eerie vibration like long, thin reeds murmuring in the wind. The sound is barely audible, but enough to send a shiver along the air. It carries with it the ghost of ancient breath, of whispered prayers, of protests swallowed by the sky. Imagine the scene centuries ago. A line of condemned individuals, rebels, prisoners of war, deserters marched toward this place at dawn. Soldiers positioned them at poles, tying or nailing them in place. Some allowed sitting supports, others did not. The process varied, but the outcome was always the same: suspension that made breathing an agony of mechanics. Every inhalation required pulling upward, every exhalation sinking downward. The body fought itself. Hours stretched into day. The sun bore down with merciless weight. At night, cold wrapped the body in a different kind of suffering. Crucifixion was not meant to be swift. It was meant to be seen. And yet, here, the field feels devoid of spectators. The loneliness is too complete, the silence too deep. Perhaps this was a remote site, a borderland where rebels were displayed as warnings to distant travelers rather than crowds. Some fringe historical accounts mention crucifixions along trade routes, where the poles served as grim mile markers. Scholars still debate the accuracy of these claims, but the imagery is striking and hauntingly similar to the place before us. We walk between the poles, the shadows stretching long across our path. Some stand close enough that their silhouettes merge. Others are set far apart, emphasizing the vastness of the field. On one, faint remnants of rope cling to a knot, hardened by age and weather. On another, the wood is smoother, as though exposure wore it down after years of bearing weight. Earlier in our journey, we encountered the iron garden, where death rose from the ground. Here, death rose into the sky. It pulled bodies upward, exposed them to the horizon, connected suffering with the open expanse of earth and heavens. There was something profoundly symbolic in that positioning, whether intended or not. The body became a silent proclamation of rebellion crushed, of power asserted, of life stretched between ground and air. We pause near the tallest pole. Its height is startling, taller than the others, perhaps used for someone seen as particularly dangerous or symbolic. The moonlight catches on a faint groove carved down its front, almost like a scar. Wind brushes against it with a soft flutter, producing a hollow whistle. It is the only sound in the entire clearing. Crucifixion, more than most methods, blurs the line between execution and message. The suffering was slow, but the display was immediate. The field behind us, the iron spikes, spoke of violence hidden in shadow. This field speaks of violence displayed under open sky. But something else lies beyond the poles. At the far end of the field, where the horizon darkens into rolling hills, a cool, faint glow creeps upward. It is not fire. It is not moonlight. It is reflection light bouncing off something crystalline. Snow. A ridge rises there, pale and glimmering in the night, leading into a colder world where breath itself once became a punishment. The pierced horizon fades behind us as we step toward the frozen vigil awaiting in the hush of winter air. The frozen vigil. The air cools with gradual insistence as we leave the field of poles behind, trading the dry hush of desert and wind-worn wood for something sharper. The ground slopes upward into pale ridges dusted with frost. Moonlight gathers along the surface of the snow, turning the world into a soft, shimmering expanse. Each step muffles beneath us, the layer of ice crystals absorbing sound, as though the land itself wishes to preserve silence. The sky above stretches wide and cold, a dome of silver stars reflected faintly in the frozen ground. Here, breath becomes visible, white clouds drifting outward, quick to fade, as though reluctant to linger in the frigid air. The cold does not rush forward. It unfurls slowly, like a curtain drawn over the land. This is not the biting chill of deep winter storms. This is the steady, suffocating cold that settles across borderlands and mountain passes, the kind that ancient communities knew intimately and feared deeply. This is the realm of exposure by cold and execution method far older than its sparse records imply. Most references to death by freezing do not appear in monumental histories. They survive instead in folk tales, legal fragments, and the rhythm of oral tradition. There is the whispered account of exiles in ancient Scythian territories around the 5th century BCE, left tethered to posts in winter fields. There are Norse sagas describing criminals cast out into the snow overnight, their fates left to wind and frost. There are Japanese records from the Heian period depicting forced exposure in mountain passes, though scholars still debate whether the practice was punitive or ritualistic abandonment. The cold serves as both executioner and witness, carrying with it a slow, inevitable verdict. The ridge before us widens into a shallow basin, its centre filled with hardened snow that gleams faintly in the moonlight. At first, the space appears untouched, a pristine surface unbroken by time. But as our eyes adjust, faint depressions emerge, shallow hollows, where the snow dips as though shaped by long-forgotten forms. They are subtle, softened by seasons, blurred by drifting frost. Yet their pattern suggests deliberation, places where bodies once lay, arranged in a quiet, sorrowful geometry. A faint wind moves across the ridge, stirring loose snow in gentle spirals. It whispers through the nearby pines, carrying with it distant echoes, thin, hollow, almost like sighs. The sound is so soft it might simply be the settling of branches, yet its cadence feels too even, too aware. Cold has a way of preserving memory differently from fire or sand. It does not scorch. It does not bury. It holds. It suspends. Imagine the ritual centuries ago. Villagers or soldiers leading the condemned into the high ridge at dusk, the sky fading into deep blue. They would come not with torches but with cloaks wrapped tightly, breath steaming in the air. The condemned, perhaps accused of treason, theft, or witchcraft, would be made to stand or lie in the snow. Some accounts suggest minimal binding, just enough to prevent escape, not enough to restrict breathing. Others indicate total restraint, arms tied behind, legs secured, leaving the body exposed to the relentless chill. The cold would begin its work immediately, numbing fingers, stiffening joints, slowing breath. But the process was rarely rapid. Exposure is a quiet executioner. It moves in increments, beginning with a false sense of clarity. The condemned might feel alert at first, senses sharpened by the sting of frost. Thoughts would race, memories fluttering in anxious bursts. Then, gradually, the cold would seep deeper, dulling the skin, slowing the heartbeat, blurring the edges of awareness. A fringe detail survives in a remote Siberian chronicle. In some communities, watchers would place carved wooden figures, small guardians around the exposed, believing that spirits of the forest judged the soul during the night's vigil. Whether literal belief or a flourish added by later storytellers, scholars still debate, but standing here in the frozen quiet, it is not difficult to imagine tiny wooden faces peering out from snowdrifts, sharing the vigil. The sky above stretches with startling clarity. Stars glimmer like shards of ice. The moon casts a pale, unwavering glow, turning every shadow into a thin, blue imprint upon the snow. This light, though gentle, is cold. It deepens the sense of isolation, marking each hollow as a testament to vigilance and surrender. As we step closer to one of the depressions, the snow crunches beneath our feet with a crystalline snap. The hollow is shallow now, but deep enough to suggest the presence of a body long ago. The snow surrounding it has resettled into soft ridges, where the warmth of life once created temporary melt. The air feels colder here, as though the ground still remembers the slow cooling of flesh. In earlier sections, we've seen how methods tied victims to earth, sky, flame, and metal. Here, nature alone dictates the pace. No executioner stands nearby with tools. No audience gathers to witness. The cold delivers its verdict with steady impartiality. It wraps the body in silence until breath fades, heartbeat slows, and consciousness slips into frost-laden dreams. Some who suffered exposure spoke in fragmented historical accounts of hallucinations, visions of warmth, figures walking beside them, voices whispering reassurance. These final sensations blur the boundary between fear and acceptance. Whether such visions were interpreted as spiritual visitations or simply the brain's response to extreme cold, scholars still debate. But the notion lingers, softening the edges of the ridge with a strange tenderness. The wind shifts again, carrying the scent of pine, snow, and something faintly metallic, echoes of earlier methods still clinging to memory. The frozen basin feels timeless, caught between worlds, a place where life thinned gradually into stillness, a place that reminds us that nature, too, can be an instrument of judgment. But even in this cold quiet, something stirs in the distance movement, not from the wind, but from life. A faint rumble, a vibration beneath the frozen ground, or something far more intentional. As we lift our gaze from the hollows, a different shape materializes along the edge of the ridge. A low stone wall encircling a depression filled not with snow, but with ancient dust and scattered bones. Beyond that wall, paw prints old, but unmistakable trail into shadow. The frozen vigil ends where earth meets arena. Something once waited there, not frost, not silence, but breath, muscle, hunger, and the night seems to hold that hunger still. The beast's arena. The ridge of snow tapers downward into a valley where frost loosens its grip, giving way to bare earth and patches of coarse, wind-swept grass. The air shifts subtly as we descend, still cold, but heavier now, tinged with the scent of soil and something more primal. Even before the ground fully levels out, we hear it. A faint, breath-like sigh carried on the wind, too low to identify, too rhythmic to dismiss. It drifts from somewhere beyond the slope, from the place where moonlight pools into a broad, shadowed basin. As we reach the valley floor, the landscape opens into a wide circular depression, its perimeter marked by a low stone wall, worn and crumbling, yet unmistakable in its intent. It is not a natural formation. The circle is too perfect, the stones too deliberately placed. This was an enclosure constructed with care, not for shelter or ritual assembly, but for something rawer, something that required containment. Inside the circle, the ground is uneven patches of sand mixed with hardened soil, scattered bones bleached white by sun and time. Some are small, rib fragments, vertebrae. Others are larger limbs from animals, possibly human remains reduced to unrecognizable shapes. The moonlight spills across them, lending each fragment a cold, spectral glow. This is the beast's arena. The execution of humans by animals, damnatio ad bestias, was famously practiced in ancient Rome, particularly from the 1st to the 3rd centuries CE, where criminals, dissidents, and prisoners of war were thrown into amphitheatres to face lions, leopards, or bears. But the origin of such practices predates Rome, appearing in earlier cultures through ritual hunts and sacrificial rites, where condemned individuals served as offerings or living tests of courage. Scholars still debate whether these proto-arena rituals were formal punishments or ceremonial spectacles. The line between the two has blurred with time. Here, in this isolated valley far from colosseums or crowds, the arena feels different. It lacks the grandeur of stone amphitheatres. Its simplicity suggests a more intimate, local adaptation, a place where communities used the presence of wild creatures, not for spectacle, but for final judgment. We step over the low wall, our boots sinking slightly into the sandy earth. A faint breeze stirs the bones, producing a dry, ticking sound as they nudge against each other. The air smells faintly of old fur and dust, as though animals once paced this ground with restless intent. Imagine the scene long ago, a ring of villagers or soldiers standing at the wall, their torchlight flickering in jagged arcs. The condemned hands bound or left free depending on the nature of the offence brought into the centre. The beasts kept in a nearby pit or crude enclosure, their growls vibrating through the night even before their release. Perhaps lions in regions where traders brought exotic animals. Perhaps wolves or packs of trained hunting dogs in areas where such predators roamed naturally. A lesser-known detail, recorded in a fragment of a Roman military diary, suggests that in remote frontier outposts, soldiers occasionally staged small-scale damnatio ad bestias using local predators, lynxes, wild boar, even large eagles. Whether these accounts reflect official punishment or the grim improvisation of isolated garrisons, scholars still debate, but the possibility lingers in the stillness of this basin, where the ground shows signs of multiple kinds of tracks, some clawed, some hoofed, some so deeply imprinted they suggest an animal of considerable weight. We kneel beside one such track, broad, rounded, pressed deep into the earth as though made when the ground was softer. It resembles the print of a large cat or bear. The edges have softened over time, but the impression remains clear enough to evoke unease, even now. Near it lies a fragment of jaw, jagged, cracked, its teeth long gone. In the moonlit quiet, it is easy to imagine the tension of those long-ago moments. The condemned standing alone in the centre, breath visible in the cool night air, the watchers holding their torches higher, their faces half-lit and unreadable. The gate or barrier creaking open, letting the animal's shape spill into the arena, low, muscular, controlled. No roar, not at first. Only the slow padding of feet against the dirt, the flicker of eyes reflecting the flames. Some condemned fought back, picking up stones, wielding broken sticks, or simply bracing themselves for the inevitable. Others froze. Still, others attempted to flee, only to find the arena walls too steep or guarded. The beasts, whether starved or merely agitated, moved with the instinctive certainty of creatures fulfilling their role in an ancient, grim choreography. As we walk deeper into the arena, the shadows cast by the wall elongate, forming bars of darkness across the ground. A cold shiver travels through the valley, not from weather, but from the sense that this place remembers movement fast, violent, final. The bones scattered around us feel like punctuation marks left behind by the passing of ancient sentences. In earlier sections, we witnessed methods that involved the elements fire, cold, earth, water. Here, judgment stepped closer to nature's red edge, harnessing the raw force of instinct. This form of execution relied not on tools or structures, but on hunger, territoriality, and fear. It was both punishment and spectacle, both intimate and unpredictable. Yet here, Far from the roar of packed stadiums, the arena's solitude suggests that its use was not for cheering crowds, but for solemn enforcement. Perhaps only a few witnesses stood by. Perhaps the beasts were not imported monsters, but local predators captured for this grim purpose. The simplicity of the structure, the single low wall, the absence of seating, supports this quieter, more unsettling interpretation. A rustle draws our attention to the far side of the arena. The wind brushes through a tangle of dried brambles growing against a break in the wall. Behind them lies a narrow, tunnel-like passage carved into the earth. Its entrance is framed by stone, worn smooth by age and weather. It seems too deliberate to be a natural formation, perhaps once used to guide animals into the arena, or to allow concealed watchers access without danger. The passage descends into shadow, sloping downward with surprising depth. A faint drip echoes from within, slow, rhythmic, like water striking hollow stone. The air near the entrance feels colder, more enclosed. The sound of dripping water grows steadier, forming a distant cadence that tugs us closer. The beast's domain fades behind us as we step toward a darker threshold, one not shaped by claws or hunger, but by confinement and drowning silence. The arena exhales its last breath as we enter the passage leading to the drowning cell. The drowning cell. The passage slopes downward in a gentle arc, its walls narrowing as though sculpted by careful, methodical hands. The air cools with each step, growing dense and wet, thick with the mineral scent of stone that has held moisture for centuries. The faint dripping we heard above now echoes through the corridor in steady, measured beats. Drip, drip, drip. Each sound falls with ceremonial precision, as though marking time in this underground world. The moonlight fades behind us as the walls close overhead, replaced by a dim glow reflected from water somewhere ahead. The floor becomes slick, the stones rounded from long exposure to dampness. Our breath forms soft clouds in the tunnel, mingling with the faint mist rising toward us. It feels as though we are descending into a place that prefers darkness, a chamber whose secrets thrive without sunlight. At last, the passage opens into a small subterranean room, circular, close-walled, its ceiling low enough that the air seems to press downward. A shallow pool occupies the center, a perfect oval carved into the stone floor. Its surface barely ripples, disturbed only by the rhythmic drip falling from a stalactite overhead. The water is dark, almost black, and impossibly still between each drop. This is not a lake, nor a flooded dungeon. This is something more deliberate. This is the drowning cell. Execution by drowning has existed since the dawn of civilization, sometimes private, sometimes symbolic, sometimes brutally direct. Ancient Mesopotamian legal codes mention individuals cast into the river as judgment. In the Roman era, certain traitors were sewn into sacks and thrown into the Tiber. Medieval Europe used drowning for women convicted of particular crimes, believing it preserved modesty even in death. Yet what we see here is not river drowning or punishment by sack. This is controlled submersion, contained and ritualized, a method that blurs the line between trial and sentence. The pool before us is shallow around the edges but deepens sharply at the center. A ring of stone carvings worn nearly smooth suggests that the condemned were once bound or held in place during the ordeal. The air above the water hangs heavy, as though infused with the memories of countless final breaths. The dripping stalactite feels almost like a metronome for fear. A fringe detail from an obscure fragment of early Celtic lore speaks of silence pools, where the accused were lowered repeatedly into water to test truthfulness. Surviving meant innocence, failure meant judgment. Whether these rituals actually existed or represent poetic metaphor, scholars still debate. But the structure of this chamber, a single controlled pool, a single dripping rhythm, resonates eerily with such tales. We step closer to the pool's edge. The stone here is smooth from wear, its surface cold even through the soles of our boots. The water emits no scent, no movement, only a faint chill that seeps upward, brushing against our skin like a ghost of submersion. In the quiet, one can almost hear the echo of splashes long faded, the struggle of limbs bound with rope or held by unseen hands. Imagine the ritual centuries earlier. A figure led into this chamber, their footsteps echoing faintly down the passage. Torches might have burned along the walls, their flames reflected in the water as trembling gold shapes. The condemned would stand at the edge, perhaps trembling, perhaps resolute. Watchers, priests, elders, or guards would gather in the shadows, their faces half lit, unreadable. The method varied. In some traditions, the condemned was lowered gently into the center hollow, held underwater until movement slowed. In others, the ordeal required repeated submersions, breathing becoming staggered, desperate, frantic. The dripping sound overhead would have filled the space like a countdown, marking each moment the lungs strained for air. And when the final submersion came, the cell's quiet would absorb the last ripples, smoothing the surface into placid silence once more. Unlike fire or blades or beasts, drowning leaves few visible marks. It is an execution of absence, absence of breath, absence of voice, absence of resistance. It is the stillest form of violence, one that requires the world to do nothing but wait. The cell's walls, slick with condensation, seem to hold that waiting even now. The water appears indifferent, cold, receptive, implacable. As we stand near the pool, the dripping grows louder in our imagination, each droplet a soft percussion against stone. Drip, drip, drip. The sound fills the chamber with a kind of slow hypnotism. It is easy to understand how this space was once terrifying. The complete enclosure, the single source of water, the lack of escape, the inevitability of each droplet drawing the condemned closer to the moment when lungs finally surrender. Earlier in our journey, we saw how water served as judgment in the still pools beneath the moonlight, reflective, ambiguous. Here, water becomes something altogether different. Not a mirror, but a shroud. We take a final step back from the pool. The chill deepens behind our ribs, as though the cell wishes to pull warmth from everything that enters. The stone walls curve inward like a closing hand, trapping sound and breath. The passage leading upward seems impossibly narrow, a thin ribbon of escape. But as we turn toward it, something catches our attention at the far end of the chamber, a low, darker opening just above water level. A tunnel, perhaps, but not like the one we entered through. This one slopes downward, its entrance jagged, carved by rougher hands or by nature itself. A faint breeze issues from its depths, not cool like the air here, but warm, dry, carrying with it the scent of dust and old stone. And beneath that scent, something else. A hollow echo, faint but unmistakable. A sound like air moving through large cavities, like breath passing through bones. The drowning cell releases us with a soft exhale as we step toward that darker tunnel, toward a place where stone and shadow once held the echoes of those who died long before water filled their lungs. A place where bones remember. The cave of echoed bones. The tunnel from the drowning cell dips sharply, its floor sloping like the throat of some enormous creature swallowing us into deeper darkness. The air warms by degrees, trading the cell's damp chill for a dry stillness that tastes faintly of dust and age. Our footsteps shift from slick stone to powdery sediment. The walls widen, then narrow, then widen again, as though shaped by alternating hands of nature and human intention. Faint currents of air drift upward from below, warm, hollow exhalations from a chamber that has not felt sunlight for centuries. Gradually, the tunnel bends to the right, revealing a faint glow ahead, not from flame, not from moonlight, but from minerals in the stone itself. Pale veins of quartz catch what little ambient light exists and scatter it in soft luminescence, enough to illuminate the space in ghostly hues. The glow clings to the rock like frost, creating a dreamlike shimmer that feels removed from the harsher rituals of the world above. Then the passage ends, and the cave opens suddenly beneath us. It is enormous, a natural cathedral carved from stone, its ceiling so high it vanishes into shadow. Stalactites hang like silent bells from the darkness above, while stalagmites rise like weathered pillars from the floor. Between them lies a field of scattered bones, pale as driftwood, spread across the cave in patterns half random, half deliberate. Some lie in loose clusters, others appear arranged, ringed around stone pedestals, or placed along narrow trenches carved into the ground. The moment we step inside, sound behaves strangely. Our breathing seems louder than it should be. A single footstep echoes 3 or 4 times in overlapping whispers, and somewhere deeper in the cavern, a faint, hollow resonance answers not quite an echo, not quite breath, but something in between. The chamber feels alive with memory. This is the cave of echoed bones. Burial alive entombment has appeared in fragments throughout history, sometimes as punishment, sometimes as ritual sacrifice, sometimes as a grim intersection of the two. In certain early cultures, caves served as natural tombs, places where offerings and bodies were left as messages to deities or ancestors. But in other traditions, rarer, darker caves became prisons of finality. There are stories from the ancient Achaemenid period, around the 6th century BCE, describing individuals sealed into rock chambers for crimes of treason or blasphemy. Whether these stories represent official practice or political slander, scholars still debate, yet the idea persists across continents. To seal a living being within stone is to let time itself finish the sentence. The cave before us bears the marks of such practices, though its scale suggests something broader than a single method. The patterns around the bones indicate both natural collapse and intentional arrangement. Some skeletons rest in seated positions against the cave wall, spines curved forward, skulls tilted as though in eternal thought. Others stretch across the ground, partially buried by sediment. A few lie inside carved niches that resemble shallow sarcophagi. And scattered throughout are smaller bones, animal remains, perhaps companion offerings, perhaps creatures that wandered in long after the rituals ceased. A thin draught moves through the cave, brushing loose dust into faint spirals. The sound echoes softly, blending with the hollow resonance deep within the chamber. The effect is unsettling, yet strangely peaceful. This place feels less like a site of violence and more like a forgotten archive, a library of bones, each one a story. Imagine the rituals that once took place here. Torches carried deep into the cavern, their flames casting dancing shadows along the walls. Elders or priests, leading the condemned through the narrow passage, chanting softly to steady their own courage. The condemned walking behind them, perhaps trembling, perhaps resigned, listening to the echoes of their own footsteps, knowing each step carried them further from the surface world. Some methods of live entombment were swift. Stones sealed the entrance, trapping the condemned inside a small cell, their fate decided by darkness and time. Others allowed more space caverns like this one, where the condemned might survive days or longer, depending on water sources, airflow, and the presence of other creatures. This cave, with its immense size and faint warmth, suggests the latter. Far more terrifying in its uncertainty, far more profound in its silence. A fringe detail recorded by a 12th century Persian traveller describes caves used for testing the truth of one's soul. Those who survived the night were considered absolved by unseen forces. Those who did not were deemed guilty. Whether these stories reflected actual ritual practice or were exaggerations meant to evoke wonder, scholars still debate. But within this cavern, the idea of surviving a single night feels both impossible and oddly plausible. The cave's warmth protects, its echoes disorient, its darkness envelops. We move closer to one of the carved trenches in the floor. Its edges are smooth, worn by time, and at the bottom lie fragments of pottery, likely vessels once holding offerings of water or grain. Burials here might not have been purely punitive. Some could have been sacrificial, others ceremonial. The boundaries blur in ancient history. Punishment becomes offering, offering becomes sacrifice, sacrifice becomes ritual memory, and memory becomes a cave, like this quiet, vast waiting. As earlier sections revealed, ancient methods often balance brutality with symbolism. Entombment embodies that balance more deeply than most. To place a living person into the earth is to reverse the order of life and death, to bury before the final breath. In some cultures, this was believed to appease spirits. In others, it was meant to erase a person without shedding blood. The cave absorbs all motives equally, holding no judgment. A dull thud echoes from somewhere in the depths, soft, distant, like a large stone shifting under its own weight. The sound repeats once, then fades, swallowed by the cavern's vastness. We listen, waiting for another sign of movement, but the cave resumes its stillness, patient and timeless. We move onward, weaving through clusters of bones, careful not to disturb their fragile rest. The mineral glow fades as we reach the far end of the cavern, where darkness deepens into a narrow exit. The air flowing from this passage is warmer still, carrying traces of resin, incense, and faint smoke scents that feel startlingly familiar after so many sections of cold, earth, water, and blood. Beyond this passage, a soft amber glow pulses gently, like the light of dying embers. The ceiling rises again, forming a long, sloped corridor that leads upward. The air grows thick with something aromatic, sweet, woody, ceremonial. The cave of echoed bones recedes behind us as we follow the scent toward a place where judgment was cloaked not in silence, but in ritual smoke. The smoke of sacred rituals. The narrow passage from the cavern stretches upward with a gentle incline, carrying us from the dry, bone-scented depths into air that feels strangely warm, warmer than any place we've passed so far. The walls widen gradually, shifting from rough stone to smoother surfaces that bear faint carvings, half erased by centuries of drifting dust and ritual soot. The scent grows stronger the farther we climb. Incense, resin, aged wood, and something faintly metallic curling together in slow, fragrant spirals. It is a scent that belongs to no single culture, but to rites older than any written memory. At last, the passage opens into a large chamber. The ceiling arches like the interior of an ancient sanctuary. Here, the smoke hangs in gentle veils, illuminated by thin shafts of moonlight filtering through cracks overhead. The light reveals what the smoke conceals. Rows of stone altars, each carved with symbols that drift between recognizable and enigmatic. Circles, spirals, figures with raised hands, trees whose trunks elongate into flame-like curls, and among them, tools, blades, bowls, ladles, wooden masks laid out as though the ritual paused only yesterday. This is not a place of haste. It is a place of deliberation, a place where death was not merely inflicted, but interpreted. Sacrificial execution, often under the guise of sacred ritual, has existed in nearly every ancient culture. Under the right circumstances, it offered a community symbolic safety, spiritual cleansing, or perceived balance with the unseen world. Yet separating true historical practice from myth has always been difficult. Archaeological finds reveal altars with binding grooves and residue that suggest blood rites. Written accounts often exaggerate or romanticize. Even now, scholars still debate which rituals described in early texts, especially those attributed to the Celts, Scythians, or pre-Roman Iberians, were literal, metaphorical, or politically distorted. But the chamber before us feels unmistakably real. The altars vary in height, some waist level, others as tall as a person's chest. Each bears its own pattern of grooves, running downward toward channels in the floor, narrow stone paths that once guided liquid toward a central basin. Time has worn the basin's edges smooth, but its purpose remains clear. The smoke rising from ancient resin still seems to spiral toward it, as if gravity and memory both draw offerings into the same space. A fringe detail from an obscure Carthaginian inscription describes ritual smoke that calmed the spirit while loosening the breath, hinting that certain sacrifices combined incense with mild toxins to place the condemned into a trance before the final cut. Whether this represents actual practice or is merely symbolic language is uncertain. Scholars still debate, but standing here, surrounded by the lingering scent of resin and metal, it feels strangely plausible that this chamber held methods designed to blur the transition between life and death. We step toward one of the altars. Its surface is cold beneath our fingertips, yet the faint scent of smoke clinging to the stone feels hauntingly warm. A shallow depression carved into the altar's center suggests where the condemned or the chosen, depending on perspective, was placed. The grooves leading away from that depression are too narrow for general drainage, too smooth for natural erosion. They were carved with intention, each line a path for blood to follow. Imagine the ritual as it once unfolded. Torches casting golden light across masks, adorned with feathers or sacred symbols. Elders or priests chanting low, rhythmic phrases that echoed through the chamber. The condemned led forward with hands bound loosely, sometimes honored, sometimes terrified, sometimes resigned. Incense burned thickly in braziers, its smoke rising in threads that twisted into shapes resembling spirits or ancestors. The participants watched the smoke as if interpreting omens in its movement. The blade used for the final act might have been simple or ornate, depending on the culture. Some favored bronze or iron, others used obsidian for its sharp, glass-like precision. The person performing the act would stand close enough that the smoke enveloped both figures. One breath shared, one fate decided. When the blade descended, the smoke thickened. At least, that is how historical descriptions often portray it, smoke acting almost as a veil over the last moments of consciousness. The sounds would be muted, the chants would continue. The offering would be understood, not simply as execution, but as communication with whatever forces governed life and death. Earlier in our journey, we encountered methods where suffering was spectacle, where cruelty was public, where pain was prolonged. Here, the atmosphere feels different, not gentle but intentional, not merciful but ritualized. The purpose, though harsh, was rooted in beliefs that saw death as passage, transformation, appeasement. A soft shift of air moves through the chamber. The smoke drifts sideways, revealing a large stone structure at the far end, a doorway framed by tall vertical pillars carved with deep, flowing lines that resemble waves or wind currents. The space beyond the door is darker still, the smoke reluctant to enter. The threshold feels final, as though whatever lies past it existed only for those who crossed willingly, or those who never returned. We move closer, the air growing warmer with each step. Incense pools around our feet like fog. The doorway seems less like an opening and more like a transition, welcoming in its architecture yet heavy with meaning. Carvings along its edges depict figures standing before it, some kneeling, some bound, some crowned, suggesting that this was more than a ritual chamber. It was the last stop, the final path. Beyond the doorway lies a slope of polished stone, leading into what appears at first to be a natural cave, but the geometry disproves it. The walls curve inward with intentional symmetry, forming a tapering passageway that guides the eye toward a distant shape. A great stone gate, inscribed with symbols almost eroded to nothing. It stands like an ancient boundary between ritual and oblivion. This is the threshold older than empire, older than myth. The place where sentences ended, where stories closed, where no one returned. The smoke swirls behind us as we step toward the no-return gate. Nightfall at the no-return gate. The stone passage narrows as we approach the final corridor, its walls curving inward like two great hands guiding us toward a point of ancient convergence. The incense-scented warmth from the ritual chamber fades behind us, replaced by an air that feels older, cooler, denser, almost expectant. Moonlight filters through narrow fissures high above, striking the walls in thin, trembling bands that shift as clouds drift across the sky outside. Each strip of light reveals carved symbols along the stone, spirals, lines, and figures, worn nearly smooth by centuries of breath and touch. Ahead, the passage expands into a long, sloping tunnel. Its floor is polished to a dark sheen not by water or tools, but by the slow, repeated passage of countless feet. Those who walked here once did so with finality. Their footsteps smooth the stone into a surface that reflects faint glimmers of moonlight, like a river of obsidian. The air hums with subtle vibration, not sound, more like memory vibrating against the skin. At the far end, rising from the depth of the tunnel, stands the gate. It is massive, far taller than a person, carved from a single slab of stone so dense it seems to drink the light around it. The surface bears carvings almost invisible now, eroded into whispers. Abstract shapes, intertwined lines, perhaps once representing stars, ancestors, or forces forgotten by time. The gate is slightly ajar, not enough to reveal what lies beyond, but enough to suggest passage. A thin wedge of darkness exists between its halves, darker than any shadow we've encountered. It seems to pull inward, beckoning, patient. This is the no-return gate. Unlike the ritual chamber behind us, this space carries no scent of incense or blood. Unlike the cave before it, it holds no bones. Unlike the wheel, the stakes, the garden of iron, it offers no instrument of violence. And yet, its silence feels heavier than any sound we've heard on this long journey. The finality here is not born of tools or torments, it is born of threshold, of transition, of crossing. Execution by entombment, abandonment, or sealed confinement appears in fragments across many cultures. Sometimes it was punishment, sometimes a ritual offering, sometimes a misguided attempt at purification. Ancient accounts from pre-Hellenistic Anatolia speak of sacred caves, where the condemned were given to the earth through sealed passages. A few Roman references in the 2nd century CE mention criminals who were led through gates of silence as part of old provincial traditions predating Roman rule, though scholars still debate whether these refer to literal spaces or metaphorical rites. The ambiguity only deepens the mystery of sites like this. Standing before the no-return gate, one senses immediately that this place was never designed for spectacle. There were no crowds here, no torches burning in tall sconces, no public declarations or ceremonial chants echoing through halls. The long tunnel behind us was not meant for witnesses, but for one solitary walk. And yet, even in solitude, the passage must have held unbearable weight. Imagine the condemned centuries ago, step by slow step descending this tunnel under pale moonlight filtering from cracks above. Their shadow would stretch across the polished stone, trembling with each breath. The air would grow cooler with every step toward the gate. The light behind them would slowly shrink into distance, and the gate, immense, quiet, unmoving, would fill their vision. No struggle, no speed, no hourglass. The method here was not violence, nor slow suffering inflicted by tools. It was surrender, deliberate, controlled, complete. A fringe detail, preserved in a single Phoenician commentary, describes the condemned being instructed to walk willingly, step by step, so the earth may take the spirit without conflict. Scholars still debate whether this refers to actual rites or merely poetic phrasing from a moral allegory. But the phrasing lingers, willingly, step by step, a choice within a sentence, a final walk into the unknown. We move closer. The dark wedge between the gate's halves appears to deepen as we approach, though the dimensions do not change. The illusion of movement, darkness shifting like breath, stems not from the stone, but from our own presence. The gate does not open. It does not close. It simply waits, the same way it waited for every figure who stood where we now stand. At the base of the gate lies a small stone platform, barely raised a threshold marker. Its surface bears faint scratches, not random marks, but deliberate strokes, as though people once carved final messages or names into the stone before passing through. Time has blurred them beyond recognition. Yet the idea that individuals left fragments of identity here, quiet gestures of remembrance, adds a layer of humanity to the place. As we rest our hand gently on the gate's surface, the stone feels cooler than the air around it. Not cold like snow or water, but a steady, somber coolness that seeps into the palm. It is a temperature that speaks of long isolation, of stone untouched by sun or life. And beneath that coolness, one imagines the faintest tremor, not movement, not vibration, but the deep heaviness of a threshold filled with unspoken stories. Earlier in our journey, we encountered methods that harnessed fire, water, earth, metal, cold, beasts, and ritual. Each held its own symbolism, its own terror, its own meaning in the context of its culture. But here, the method transcended tools. The execution lay in the passage itself, in being sealed beyond the gate, left in darkness, where the world no longer reached. Whether the space beyond contained a chamber, a narrow cell, a deep cavern, or simply a void, is something we will never know. The term "no return gate" tells us only that those who entered never walked back into the world of the living. A soft breeze drifts through the narrow gap between the gate's slabs, warm, impossibly warm given the coolness of the stone. It touches our face like an exhale, not sinister but ancient, the breath of a space sealed off from time. The air carries no scent, no sound, only the faint sensation of release. Night gathers more deeply outside. Moonlight slants across the tunnel behind us, dimming as clouds thicken overhead. The stone beneath our feet feels smoother now, as though polished by the imagined footsteps of those who came before. The silence drapes over the chamber like a long shroud. And then, far behind us, somewhere at the edge of memory, a faint sound rises, a soft wind through the iron garden, or a creak from the wheel, or a drip from the drowning cell. The echoes of everything we've passed seem to gather here, converging like quiet ghosts travelling on the same wind. The no-return gate stands steady, patient, unchanged. A reminder that history does not only contain methods that shaped endings, it holds thresholds that never tell what came after. We turn from the gate at last. The darkness behind its slabs remains untouched. Whatever lies beyond belongs to another world, one into which we are not meant to step. Behind us, the long tunnel leads back toward the faint light of the world above, where night still drapes the ancient landscape, and history whispers in low, patient breaths. Conclusion. In the hush that follows our long descent, the night gathers itself around the old landscape, as though drawing a soft curtain over the memories we have stirred. The wind moves gently across the clearings, touching stake and wheel, stone and sand, as if reminding them that their stories no longer carry weight. Moonlight settles on each place we walked, on the hanging tree's quiet silhouette, the desert's shifting breath, the frozen ridge, the no-return gate softening every edge the centuries could not erase. And in that stillness, a truth emerges like a faint echo. History does not whisper these methods to celebrate cruelty, but to remind us how far the human heart can drift when fear and power eclipse compassion. Yet the same night that once held suffering now holds peace. We leave the ancient paths behind, stepping gently into the waiting dark.